I'm Faz Shakir.
I'm Amanda Litman, and this is Battleground. Faz is still gone this week, spending time with his very cute new baby. This week on Battleground, we're talking to Ai-jen Poo, co-founder and executive director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance.
It is this army of women of color, who support the families that operate everything else in our economy.
Ai-jen Poo, welcome to Battleground.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I'm so happy to talk to you.
Let's start with some level setting. Can you tell folks a little bit about what the National Domestic Workers Alliance does?
Yes, we are an organization that works on behalf of the 2.2 million, mostly women, who work inside of our homes as nannies, house cleaners, and home care workers. They do the work that makes everything else possible, but it's work that's undervalued and invisible, and it's mostly women of color who do this work, and our job is to lift up this workforce, build power, and make these jobs good jobs that you can take pride in and support your family on.
You have done interviews where you've talked about seeing your mom and your grandmother take care of your family and community, and how that really influenced you to get into this part of organizing. Is there a specific caregiver early on in your career that you think about when you do this work?
Definitely, I think growing up watching how much of the work that my mom and my grandmother did was kind of taken for granted and not accounted for or recognized, and yet it was so essential for everyone's existence. And then I think when I moved to New York, it's just so striking. Anyone who's ever walked the streets of Manhattan on a weekday, all these women of color pushing white babies in strollers, and it's the most visible, invisible workforce. And you can't help but just stop and think about how it is this army of women of color, who support the families that operate everything else in our economy. And so it's like the work before anything else can happen. I volunteered on a domestic violence hotline in New York City that was for Asian immigrant women survivors of domestic violence. And many of them were calling about their abuse and the dynamics there, but one of the biggest challenges they faced was the fact that they were in jobs that didn't pay enough to make ends meet, and they were worried about how they were going to support their kids if they left their abusers. And I just remember so many of those stories late at night, just being like, wow, how could it be that so many women are working so hard and doing everything in their power, and it's still not enough to keep themselves and their families safe?
I was raised in part by a nanny from Trinidad who lived in our home. My parents helped her get her green card, sponsored immigration. And then later in my teenage years, a Filipino woman lived in our home to take care of my grandmother. So I lived with both sort of ends of that caregiving space.
Yeah.
And the more that we talk about care infrastructure as part of this sort of legislation, reconciliation, sort of governing philosophy, my mother and my family would not have been able to survive without both of those women as part of it.
That's
taking
right.
care of us as kids and taking care of my grandma at the end of her life.
That's right.
Can you, for people who may not be familiar with the term care infrastructure, can you define that for folks?
Well, sure. So I think most folks don't even really think about infrastructure in general, but it's been so much a part of the policy conversation right now, because when we think about recovering from an economic crisis or recession, one of the first things that Congress does is invest in infrastructure jobs that are about repairing roads and bridges and tunnels. And so we think about physical infrastructure, and we think about it in terms of what gets us to work every day, right? And what enables the economy to function, what enables society to function. And the thing about it is, because the realm of care has largely been assigned to women and sort of assumed and taken for granted that women will do, we haven't even thought of it as infrastructure, but it is actually the most fundamental thing in our lives that enables everything else to happen and function. And, I think Senator Casey said recently in a hearing, it's like some people need a bridge to get to work and some people need childcare to get to work. Even the men who are going to be repairing our bridges and tunnels need care in order to get to their jobs, to do their work. And so we have started to talk about care as infrastructure because that is what it is. And in order for us to start thinking about it as something we need to be investing in as a society, as a nation, we have to start thinking about it in that way. It's a public good and it's absolutely essential.
So there's a couple components to this. There's the people who are doing the work, the caregivers, and then the people who need the care or who benefit from
Yes.
someone else doing the work. Let's start with the people who need the care. There are kids, and then there are sort of the elderly, I think, is the biggest bucket. So there's certainly some others that I'm almost inevitably leaving
Yeah,
out.
people with disabilities.
People with disabilities.
Yeah.
What are we currently doing now for the folks that need the care, and what should we be doing?
Everyone needs care at some point in our lives. The reality is that as a country, we need more care than ever before because the baby boom generation is aging. There's 4 million people who turn 65 every year. And then millennials are having babies. 4 million babies are born every year. Huge needs for care on both ends of the generational spectrum. And we have very little in place to support that. So if you need childcare, the average cost is about $9,000 per year. And the average cost of a private room in a nursing home is about $100,000 per year. But 60% of the American population makes less than $60,000 per year. So the numbers just don't add up. People can't afford it. So we have some programs in place that support very, very, very low income people to get access to care, child care, and you can completely spend down your assets and get access to home care through Medicaid or long-term care through Medicaid. But for most of us, we're in that in-between space where we're having to basically pay out of pocket a lot of money to be able to afford to care for the people we love. And what we have is essentially an overworked and underpaid caregiving workforce that we rely on. Child care workers, early childhood educators, home care workers. The average annual income of a home care worker is $17,200 per year. Can you imagine trying to support your family on that amount of money? And so because the wages are so low, we have really high rates of turnover and massive home care deserts all over the country where people who need the services and are eligible for some of these publicly funded programs can't get access to the services. And the whole conversation right now is about how, coming out of this pandemic, how can we invest in our caregiving infrastructure in a way that both makes care affordable and accessible for the families who need it and raises wages and makes these jobs good jobs that you can really sustain in. And we are closer than we've ever been to realizing that potential. It's actually a game changer. And so I feel hopeful, and the challenge is enormous because we've underinvested in care for everyone for so long. In the pandemic, we all just kind of realized, hey, we're doing the very best we can and we need help.
It feels like this is a relatively new problem, which I know that's not true, but it feel like all of a sudden this is a crisis. Is there a moment in which things shifted from like status quo to 5-alarm fire?
It's been a simmering crisis for a really long time. And then I think what happened in the pandemic is everyone dealt with a version of an emergency, a 5-alarm, with kids home from school and daycares closed and nursing homes on lockdown and parents isolated thousands of miles away. Like we all dealt with our own version of a crisis. And I think before the pandemic, we were simmering in it, but we mainly thought about it as our individual problem, like a personal burden and responsibility that if we couldn't figure it out, it was a personal failure. Like we had the wrong job, or we didn't save enough, or a bad parent, bad daughter, any number of narratives that were about blaming ourselves for the problem. And I think in the pandemic, we all just kind of realized, hey, we're doing the very best we can, and we need help. We need public programs, policy, a strong workforce to support us. And I think that care awakening that we had amidst a care crisis is what's enabling this moment where we're actually going to try, I hope, to address it, which is really exciting.
So what does the legislation actually do?
So in the president's Build Back Better agenda, he proposes hundreds of billions of dollars in investment in childcare, paid family and medical leave, and home and community-based services for the aging and people with disabilities. And within that commitment is a commitment to raise wages for the workforce that is a direct investment in good jobs for women and women of color. It is a total game changer. And right now, as part of the $3.5 trillion budget plan that the Senate just kind of took the next step forward on, is that commitment. So we have the potential to invest in a significant way in our ability to get access to the care we need for our families across the lifespan, and make sure that these jobs become good jobs for the women who do them.
Is it enough?
It's a really big step forward. So for example, in home care, 88% of Americans would prefer to age at home and in the community instead of going into a nursing home. And 70% of the home care workforce works through the Medicaid program. So if we invest in the Medicaid program the way that the president has proposed, we can both expand access to those services and bring the more than 800,000 people who are currently eligible but are on waiting lists because they don't have the funding to support their services. And we can create about 1.1 million new good jobs per year in the sector. I mean, is that enough to meet the massive need for home care going into the future? No, but it is a massive step forward. And I mean transformative.
Do you think it's going to pass?
I am determined.
That's the right answer.
I am determined. And there's this whole beautiful ecosystem of organizations called Care Can't Wait that is working together to make it real. And everybody's organizing. There's all kinds of events during August recess and into the fall that are bringing families together in every congressional district around the country to talk about their care stories, talk about how excited they are about this moment. And we're organizing. We're not going to stop until we get it done, because I think this is like a once in a generation opportunity for us to invest in care, invest in our families and these workers and in women. I mean, we've got to do this. There's no other way.
Do you find the debate over whether or not it's infrastructure, I would say I find it infuriating, because of course it is infrastructure. And even if you disagree with the definition, we need to invest in it. We need to invest in it.
The definition of government is to really help solve for society's problems that cannot be solved by individuals or by the market. And this is the quintessential definition of that, right? When the government needs to come in and help us find collective solutions. And I think, however you want to call it, if you want to call it infrastructure or not, I think we just need to invest big time.
Can you give us a short history lesson here? How did we get to this place of women's work being so obviously devalued?
Oh, wow. Well, I think our entire economic model is based on the idea that when it comes to caregiving and work inside of the home, that is the domain of women. It's always been associated with women and assumed that women will do. And as a profession, care work has always been associated with women of color. Some of our first domestic workers in the United States were enslaved African women. And the fact that this industry, this workforce, is deeply rooted in a legacy of slavery in this country, has really shaped how it's been treated in law and policy. And in the New Deal, when Congress was debating the big social contract, the labor laws that would define how workers are treated in our laws, Southern Dixiecrats refused to support those labor laws if they included equal protections for domestic workers and farm workers who are Black at the time. So it's part of a legacy of racism in this country that we have devalued this work, in addition to the deep devaluing of women's work that has been a part of our economic model for forever. And it's amazing that we have this moment in our generation this year in 2021 to really start to flip that, to really start to put at the forefront and at the center a revaluing of care and the care economy and the workers who are the backbone of it. It's actually really profound if you think about it in the context of and history of this country.
Are there other countries that get this right?
There are other countries that make childcare, paid leave, and long-term care much more affordable and accessible and have it really built into their social safety net, their public infrastructure. They have invested in it as a public good in a different way. But I will say that across the board, I don't think that there's a country in the world that's adequately valued the caregiving workforce and really lifted up the incredible nature of this work and the women who do it. It is difficult work that is skilled labor that requires strength and emotional intelligence and perseverance and dedication, and we still culturally refer to it as help, right? We don't even think about it as the dignified profession that it is for millions of women and some men too. And what's crazy about it is a lot of economists are predicting that by the year 2030, because of our huge need for care in this country and the fact that these jobs can't be outsourced or automated, that care jobs could be the largest single occupation in the entire American workforce by the year 2030. So we have got to make these jobs good jobs, not just for the workers who do them, but for the future and well-being of our economy as a whole.
Almost all care workers are women. A majority are women of color. Most are poor. So we're talking about the most vulnerable members of our society who are almost 201 underrepresented in our political process and our political system, many of whom can't vote. And on the flip side of that is a majority of lawmakers in Congress who are men, who are white, who are millionaires. They represent a social class that obviously benefits from cheap, exploitable labor. How do you overcome that?
We organize. The whole purpose of our work as a movement is to help domestic workers and women of color be powerful in our policy, in our politics, and in our culture. And the domestic workers movement launched an organization called Care in Action, and our whole focus is reaching infrequent women of color voters who would vote, but our political system and culture has not prioritized them, has not invested in them, and our entire mission is to do that. I think that that's what will be required, is all of us coming together and investing in our democracy, becoming one where every single person can be powerful and heard. That word essential has been so important and profound in the pandemic.
Let's return to the pandemic for a moment. So, as we talked about before, it is deeply apparent the care infrastructure is broken, forcing everyone to stay at home and having people take care of their kids and do their jobs, and schools being closed has really illuminated this, I think, especially for people who may not have seen it before. Over the last year, has anything changed for care workers?
I think that culturally, the fact that we are recognizing so much work in our economy as essential for the very first time, that word essential has been so important and profound in the pandemic. The fact that so many workers, from grocery workers to delivery workers to warehouse workers, we just never really thought about them before. And they are all low-wage workers, disproportionately women, women of color. And we're now calling them essential. Like, that's significant. Now, are we treating them as essential yet? Not yet. And that's the case for care workers. I think it means a lot that for care workers to know that they are being recognized for their essential contributions. And I think what we need to do now is make sure that that's really reflected in our law and policy and in this reconciliation budget in particular.
This might be a dumb question, but I'm coming back to something you said earlier about both the high cost of both childcare and elder care and the low wage for these workers. How can both of those things be true? Where is the disconnect? Why would it be so expensive for when I one day have a kid to send it to daycare and for the person providing the daycare not to get paid enough money?
Mm. Because you have this whole part of the economy that we've never really invested in. And so it's kind of like a Wild West where anything goes. And the norms and the standards are not reflective of a part of the economy that we value, that we take seriously. And so you have all kinds of agencies that overcharge families and underpay workers, and that's the business model. It's a really big challenge that we have to both make care affordable and accessible to everyone, set new norms and standards where we can all expect a quality of care and a quality of jobs. And I think what we're doing right now in terms of what Congress is considering is the big first step to getting there.
Can you talk a little about sort of like the emotional chaos wrapped up in caregiving for women in particular?
Part of the devaluing of the care economy is an underestimation of what is required to do this work. And so what you have is a whole way in which women have internalized that they're supposed to do all of this on their own, on top of everything else, without support, financially or otherwise, without infrastructure. And it's kind of fed by a version of American individualism where we're all supposed to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. It's like the gendered version of that. And so it's really deep what women have internalized in terms of what we must shoulder in our families and therefore in the economy. And it is essentially the house of cards that collapsed in the pandemic. And we have to make sure that what we build coming out of it is not a house of cards, but a totally different set of choices for women.
What's the dream for you? When will you be able to say, check, done, next problem to solve?
I'm going to have a really, really big party when we pass the Build Back Better agenda and we win really massive investments in childcare, paid leave, and home and community-based care. But, long term, my dream is that we would have what I call universal family care in this country. The idea that we would have one efficient program that we're all contributing to, that we can all benefit from, that helps us afford quality childcare, paid leave, quality home and community-based care or long-term care in the setting of our choice, where we don't have to worry about affording to take care of the people that we love as we work and as we contribute what we have to contribute to the world. And that's where I'd love for us to end up someday, because that would enable every single family, caregiver, care worker to be able to live, work, and care with dignity.
That's beautiful. I love your vision for this country. It makes me think like, oh, maybe it's possible.
I think it is. This is a great country in so many ways. So many things have stood in our way. Structural racism, misogyny, classism, ableism. So many things have stood between us and greatness. And the only way to undo and push through all of that is to get in it and build it and change it.
Thank you for the work you do at NDWA and every other organization you run. And thank you for taking the time to talk with me today, Ai-jen. I appreciate it.
It was so fun to talk to you, Amanda.